Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm joined by previous guest, writer Graeme Thomson. Hello, Graeme.
Hi, Ali. How you doing?
I'm really well, and we're here to talk about your new book. I've got my copy here, In Another World, The Four Seasons of Talk Talk. And of course, the first question has to be, why Talk Talk?
Oh, well, I mean, it's been on my to-do list. We have to read list. I have a to write list, and that's been very high up on it for a very, very long time. And as I write in the book, those albums and that band hit me very hard at quite an impressionable age. So I've always wanted to, and I have written about them actually quite a bit over the years in magazine pieces and features and things. So I've always wanted to get stuck into those records, and I think it's taken a while to obviously to get, you need a publisher, you need people to get on board with that idea, and also just to find a way of doing it, really. Find a way of and working out what to say about those records. So it's a bit like I wrote a book about Simple Minds, Scenes of Great Cities, which is always one I wanted to write, and this is a kind of in the same mold. It's something that I feel is kind of plucked straight out of my record collection, really.
Yeah. It's an interesting comparison because in the Simple Minds book, you were looking at the early albums. You were looking specifically at the kind of before they went kind of mega and venues and all that stuff. And here you're looking at their you're looking at four albums, let's put it that way. Because, Talk Talk, well, it was interesting. When did you first encounter Talk Talk? Was it with one of these albums or was it earlier?
No, it was with one of these albums, yeah, because like you say, they're sort of the anti-Simple Minds, is that they started quite poppy and commercial, and then they went into the wilds. So the first album I heard as an album was Spirit of Eden, which was their fourth record. And at that point they became a very uncommercial band. It was after the singles, after It's My Life and Today and Talk Talk and Life's What You Make It, with those records that people will, and I would have heard those songs. Well, I certainly would have heard Life's What You Make It and Living in Another World, but I hadn't explored those records at all. So the first album I heard in this early summer of 1989, which would have been a few months after it came out, was Spirit of Eden. And I was played it kind of quite ceremoniously by a mate of mine who was very into that, into quite head music, like Pink Floyd and Serge Gainsbourg and stuff like that. So, he sat me and my brother down and said, you need to check this out. And it instantly just knocked me out. I was 15. And so I went back to Colour of Spring, which was the previous record, their third album. And I never really went back any further than that. Back in those days when you had to make a real effort to get an album or buy it, you couldn't just stream it or check it out. So I never did buy the first two records till much, much later. So that's what the book really, that's where it starts. It starts with Spirit of Eden and me going back to Colour of Spring to check it out. And then I bought Laughing Stock the week it came out in my first week at university in Glasgow. I have a very vivid memory of that. And then Mark Hollis' solo record, which I kind of fold into the Four Seasons. That is sort of the conceit of the book. So, I kind of came to them after they really were a functioning band. They'd stopped playing live. They'd stopped releasing singles of any commercial note. So, partly the book is kind of about that, about how we meet music and when and what it means to us at that time.
That's what really struck me. It was that the music that kind of means the most to us is almost always about timing as well. When you get to it as well. I also love that idea of someone sitting you down and ceremoniously going. That's happened to me a few times with a good friend's dad who sat me down to play Blood on the Tracks, Bob Dylan. Listen to this, boys. We were far too young to take it in, but he was determined you should listen.
Divorce album, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And weirdly, well, not weirdly, but years later at a party where someone says, "Oh, you've got to hear this," and it was the Counting Crows' first album. And said, you got this, the songwriting and everything. And it is a great record. But I think on the reverse, I think I did that with the Blue Nile's Hats to someone once. You've got to, it might even have been my brother, sit down and listen to this.
I mean, it can sometimes be a bit off-putting. You don't always want to be like, this is great, you're going to have to love this. And I'm sure there's times it's happened when it hasn't quite hit me. But that, and interesting, it seems to be the way that record kind of got a foothold in the culture in a way, because it's now, Spirit of Eden is now quite a kind of beloved album. And I think it was with people just spreading the word, and sitting people down, and people in bands, I think especially going, you need to check this out. It's an extraordinary album. So I thought it was kind of resonant to talk about a little bit about how I first met that record to you.
Absolutely, because this, and I wonder if it's partly, but where the structure comes from is a very personal take on it. There's interludes where you discuss, and right from the beginning, actually, you discuss what these albums mean to you. It's a little interesting for people who don't know the band Talk Talk to think about the earlier band, because when I first encountered them in the early to mid 80s, they were very much kind of not quite new romantic, but new wave. Their contemporaries were bands like Duran, perhaps, and Spandau, and it was the sharp suits and thin ties and very much synthesized, which they would definitely move away from. And they did have some hits, records that probably still get played in certain places, like Radio Clyde or Radio 2 to this day. So they could write a tune right from the start. There's no doubt about that. That was going on. But then, for me, I think the song that started them, and you could see maybe what was to follow, was "It's My Life," which is on the second album.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know you don't cover that, but do you see the kind of roots of what may follow in that track?
I think you do. I think you do, and also that, I mean, very significantly, that's the song that he began his collaboration with a guy called Tim Freese-Green, who was sort of the unofficial fourth member of Talk Talk, and who co-wrote and produced all those records from It's My Life onward. He's a very important part of the book, and part of the book is about, sometimes there's a kind of tendency to talk about Mark Hollis and Talk Talk as a synonymous thing, like they're the same entity, and this guy was, Tim Freese-Green was incredibly important, as were the band members too. I think you can definitely hear elements on that song and on that record, but as you say, it's a very synthetic sound still. I mean, there's a lot of acoustic guitars on that album, but it's very mid-80s, 84. It's very much, it folds into what's happening in the music scene at that time beautifully. He was a great pop writer. I mean, there's no question about that. The melodies are always there in his music, I think, right till the very end. And it's weird, I didn't register that song at the time. I would have been 11 probably when that came out, and it just didn't. It was a fairly minor hit. I think we think maybe it was a bigger hit than it was. And actually that applies to some of, Life's What You Make It as well. It wasn't they didn't have huge top 10 hits really. They were, I think, 20, 30.
One of the reasons it resonates, and also Life's What You Make It, is they both had cracking videos. And at that time, video TV, music TV was really starting to come through. So often songs that maybe weren't massive hits in the charts would get heavy rotation. And we had just got our first VHS about that time, so any bit of music was being taped and watched over again. Let's talk a little bit about the structure of it, because you mentioned there's 4 seasons, there's 4 albums. So could you talk a little bit about that and how that came about?
Yeah, because I said earlier, part of the reason the book took so long for me to write, it both in general terms of my writing kind of career, but also just in terms of how long it did take to write, was just to find a way into the music that I felt was somehow appropriate, and I suppose The Color of Spring sets it up.
Yeah.
That idea of there being a sort of seasonal aspect to it. And I think there is a very elemental aspect to those records in particular, that they kind of, Spirit of Eden has a kind of very bucolic, summery feel to it. So I got this idea that I wanted to write with 4 records, and in a sense, starting with Spring is a no-brainer with The Color of Spring, and then talking a little bit about how they felt to me, because obviously there'll be people who, heard Laughing Stock in high summer, and to them that feels like a summer album. To me, it's an album that's, as I write in the book, that's kind of drifting into winter, and it feels musically and thematically and lyrically quite a dark record, and it was quite a hard record to make. So I felt, and the idea of the title of the book being In Another World, that this was a kind of enclosed cycle of music in some ways, from spring to summer to autumn, with the solo album, which came out in January 1998. So it's a sort of winter album, and it's the end as well. It's the last thing we ever hear of Mark Hollis. So I felt that was a way of trying to kind of pull together quite a disparate band and quite a disparate artist, and huge silences within, you know, the story of Talk Talk. It felt to me quite a nice resonant way of pulling it together.
Because we should say one of the other striking things about the book is that people who are in the band, well, Mark Hollis obviously is no longer there, but even before that, they don't talk to you for the book. And they rarely talked about the band, ironically, even before that. You know, there's not a lot of stuff you could go back and get interviews and articles.
No, very little. I mean, in terms of anyone who isn't Mark Hollis, no, there's very little, you know, on record interviews. And, you know, Mark did stuff when albums came out and he would talk about the music. But not since, you know, the late 90s. He didn't do an interview until his death in 2019. So there wasn't, I mean, there's stuff there, but there's not a ton of stuff there. Yeah. And I wasn't expecting anyone to sit down. You know, none of the band have sat down and done an interview about Talk Talk for 20 odd years. So I wasn't expecting that. And actually, in a way, so, I mean, maybe too much is made of that sometimes. You know, if you write about the Beatles, you're not going to get the Beatles to sit down, and you're not going to get Paul and Ringo to give you a dedicated interview. I've written about Kate Bush. You know, I wasn't expecting her to cooperate. So that's fine in a way. It kind of opens up other areas. And I did speak to a lot of people who were in the room or came into the room and played on those records. And in some ways, that perspective is just as illuminating and interesting. And because often they're as baffled as we are about what was going on when these records are being made.
It's interesting, again, to make the comparison with your Simple Minds book, because you did have access to nearly everyone there. I mean, do you think, what are the differences then when you've got the kind of the talking heads who actually play on these records as opposed to the ones that many of them didn't?
Hugely different, because you've got someone, I mean, like Jim Kerr, who is a very articulate about the music and what and his vision for the music and what he's trying to do. And he's absolutely clear usually about what his intentions are. So you're kind of led by that, by someone who really has a kind of overview on the music that they've made and helped create with a band. So, you know, in that situation, I think you kind of go with it. You know, you're getting a lot of insight from everyone, and you're getting the musicians who are creating the music, you know, Derek Forbes and Mick McNeil, spoke to all those guys. So that's great. You know, if people can explain what they're trying to do and what they're trying to make you feel, and I can add to that with my own sense of what the music is. But also, but you know, it was very clear very early on from reading interviews that Mark Hollis was never capable of doing that. You know, he wasn't someone who could explain what he wanted either to the musicians he was working with or to an interviewer, really. I mean, the music and the art is a completely kind of separate part of him in a way. You know, that was what was very striking to me, was that the people who knew him well just saw him as a very ordinary guy, and where this stuff lived in him, it only really lived in the music that he made. It wasn't really something that he was able to, or willing, or wanted to talk about. So that's a mystery that I think gives you a whole other kind of freedom as a writer, and a whole other area of interest as a writer when you can sort of explore that, because it's a bit of a puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, we should say almost perfectly, and just from what you said, Mark Hollis is the figure who dominates the book, just as he kind of dominated the band. I think it's fair to say that, and we'll talk, I think, more about him in detail later on. But I wonder, just from what you're saying there, if perhaps there was a frustration that he couldn't describe the music he was making in the way that some other artists can. You know, there might have been, well, I don't have the vocabulary, or I just, you know, can't get it in my head to talk about what I do. I just do it.
Well, it's certainly frustrating for the guys who worked for them, because, I mean, what part of the story of Talk Talk is this kind of attritional, you know, they start as 4, then there's 3, then there's 2, and then there's just one guy at the end. And actually, he was someone who needed a collaborator. And people often ask, well, why did he stop making music? And it may be that just that there wasn't people around sufficiently who could kind of translate what he wanted or put up with that way of working, because it was very, very labor intensive and quite difficult. So I think it must have been frustrating for him as well, but I think that's just how he worked. He was prepared to put the hours in, but the people around him, certainly it became more and more difficult, I would say, for them to kind of. I spoke to a guy called Warren Livesley who worked very closely on the solo record and eventually got taken off. And he said he could never understand what made a piece of music good or bad for Mark. He could never work out how to please him or how to get to where he wanted to be. It would just be a process of hours and days and weeks of working on tiny little bars of music. And then Mark would go, no, it's no use. It's out. And he never knew why. And he stopped asking why.
Yeah.
So that must be incredible. And he said that was very frustrating for me, because I thought we were working on something really quite promising. And it's gone. Yeah. And it's those shades of nuances between good and bad, that seemed to be what kind of singled him out as a very unique artist, that he could hear that, but he couldn't really say why.
And, as much as that would be frustrating for everyone that worked with him, and I think by the end, you're suggesting he maybe burnt all his bridges there as well.
Quite a lot, yeah.
But it also must be frustrating for him, because if you think, well, just do it, because, I've got it up here, just do it, then, he's a fascinating character, absolutely fascinating.
It is, and as I write in the book, the first song on the solo record, which is confusingly called "The Color of Spring," but is a solo track, and it's only, it's a very simple 2-chord pattern on the piano that it starts. And he didn't write that, he got someone else to write that. And you feel like he just couldn't maybe access that degree of simplicity himself, or he didn't feel it was worthy. It had to be worked over. And so it's a very fascinating and complex kind of way of writing.
So I'm interested, if it's okay with you, taking the 4 albums and just talking a little bit about when you encountered them and, kind of, and what they meant to you. Now, you've already mentioned that The Colour of Spring wasn't the first one that you encountered. I think it might be the first album of theirs that I bought through the single Life's What You Make It. I think it's a great single. Oh, yeah. The story behind it's fascinating in the book, because they wanted basically, I think by this point, Mark Hollis particularly didn't want to be a singles band, but the record company wanted a single and said, could you write something like this?
Yeah, so they were still just about in that phase where, there were commercial expectations, and it's a classic story. The Suits come along to the studio, and we don't hear the single. And I spoke to Peter Walliscroft, who was one of the engineers on that record, and he was around, and he said Mark and Tim went ballistic and went, we're not doing that. And then they kind of started to see it as it's almost like a Dadaist sort of project to come up with something hooky. And the record company the guy from the record company went, we want something really catchy, like the Bran Flakes advert. And I don't know if you all remember the 80s, tasty, tasty, very, very tasty. It's very tasty. This will spoil your enjoyment of that song forever, probably, when you start to hear that picked over the top. And so if you listen to that piano riff, and they also were listening to Green Onions, the classic Booker T song, and Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush, which has got that 1-chord groove all the way through it. And they they thought, well, rather than just throw a tantrum, we're going to kind of approach this as a sort of art project, that we can make something. On the surface, it's quite banal and quite simple, but is actually, as you say, a fantastic, incredible song and record. The way it sounds. So they were still just about at that point willing to play that game, and I think, thank God they were, because actually that song wouldn't have existed without them getting that little prod. And it also showed they could work quite quickly. That was put together really quite quickly, unlike the rest of the album and the rest of the albums that followed. They could kind of knock that stuff out. There's stuff that was left off that record that is very, very hooky and catchy as well. and I think there is that just sense of at that point they're sort of setting sail and weighing anchor and going, right, we're leaving this stuff behind, really.
And
Um,
again, I was thinking about the video, and I think it might have been the last time I saw Mark Hollis on screen, so to speak. You know, there weren't many videos after that. And you know, this is a cool band. They look the part. It's a great video shot at night with the, you know, if anyone hasn't seen it, go to YouTube and check it
Tim Pope, I think, yeah.
out. But yeah, I mean, he had kind of pop star appeal.
Definitely did. Yeah, I mean, they were a big success. I mean, and also, I mean, incredible live band. If you look at the footage of them playing, probably Montreux in 1986 is the one that's most kind of readily available, and they're absolutely banging. I mean, they're a really powerful, huge sound. He sings fantastically well. It's you can understand why they were effectively given, you know, carte blanche with the next record to go in the studio for a year with a huge budget and make what the record company would have thought was going to be a hugely kind of successful commercial album. Of course, they didn't do that. They made Spirit of Eden, but you know, you could. I think I mentioned in the book. You know, you could see them making something like "Sowing the Seeds of Love" or something by Tears for Fears. You know, a really kind of smart, sophisticated adult pop record, because that's kind of what they were doing. And there is, you know, was something lost? Was, you know, is it a shame that there wasn't more commercially orientated music from Mark Hollis and the band? Maybe, I don't know. It's a
Having
question.
first encountered Spirit of Eden, what did you think then when you subsequently heard The Colour of Spring? Was it a kind of pale imitation to you, or
No, definitely not a pale imitation. I think I've always found it a little locked. You know, I mean, there was a sneering review at the time that called it Anglo was it coffee Anglo-centric coffee table music. You know, and which is a very very harsh and poor review of the color thing. But you kind of know what they're talking about. You know, it's very plush, it's very polished, it sounds absolutely incredible. You know, the time and effort that was spent recording it and recording the drums and using the Fairlight and getting locked in. So it's a very beautiful, but it's always coming to it from Spirit of Eden. It's always felt a little like things going back into boxes a little bit, or being locked in or restrained a little more. But I know a lot of people who think it's their greatest achievement. It is the kind of synthesis of, a bit like Hounds of Love, and I make it a comparison in the record. It's that synthesis of kind of art and commerce and pop and experimentation, and I can definitely hear that. You know, it's a beautiful record.
but actually, what you show in the way you've done the book is the progression of the music and almost losing things as you go along. Less is more, I think, seems to be the mantra that certainly Mark Hollis has as he moves through all of these records.
Just taking stuff out. I mean, that's what took. It's really what took so long is not the writing the songs or coming up with the structure of the songs. It's finding something new, like a new sound or a new color, or you know, what to take in and what to leave out, or what to move. You know, because they're not. You know, you can listen to Spirit of Eden and think that it's a jam. You know, you think it can sound like, you know, 4 or 5 guys in the studio just sort of playing together, which of course it isn't at all. You know, it's ruthlessly manipulated. Every note, every second is kind of placed and put together and moved around. It's not reproducible in any sense, and it wasn't played live in any sense. So so yes, it was all about, once you kind of have a basic sense of the shape of the music, bringing something new and something surprising to kind of every moment on that record. And I think that's why every time you hear it, there's something else might just pop in, or there's things you maybe haven't heard before, or there's an element of a track that comes out at you from a different angle and becomes more prominent. And that's, you know, that's an amazing thing after 40 years nearly.
One of the great things about reading this book has been to go back and listen to all of these albums with fresh ears. And there's a couple of them that are two of my favorite albums. One I shared with you. But, you know, because you're giving such detail about the process, I think, and not just the process, but the almost philosophy behind it as well, then that's when you start to kind of re-listen, I think, to them and have new takes on them. So which brings me to Spirit of Eden, because for many people, this is the classic Talk Talk album, but it wasn't initially thought like that.
No, I mean, it kind of vanished very quickly. I mean, again, it was released in 1988, so we're talking about a world where Talk are returning after The Colour of Spring and making, Life's What You Make It, Living in Another World, two big radio hits, very successful touring band. And they return with nothing that fits into that world. So there's no single. There's a single released shortly after the album comes out called I Believe in You, which I think is the last time we see Mark Hollis performing a song on screen, very reluctantly. There's no radio play, there's no tour, there's no live shows. There's a smattering of reviews and interviews, and that's it. It's not. And something I wanted to correct a little bit was it wasn't sort of slammed at the time. It wasn't met with terrible reviews. It was reviewed very well and very respectfully, really. But it had nowhere to go, really, because nobody heard it. I think it got into the top 20, no doubt based on first week sales because it's Talk and they're a band that's got a degree of a following. But that was it. And so it kind of vanished for a long, at least a decade, really. It wasn't a record that people talked about. And then it started to sort of pick up this sort of word of mouth reputation.
And bands, kind of musically admired bands, would then say, oh, well, this is a great influence on us. And that, because now, or certainly in the last 20 years or so, if there was the best 100 albums of all, it almost always appears on one of those.
But like Astral Weeks in a way, I think, in a sense, it didn't sell, wasn't really that well regarded at the time. And then, by the 80s, you start to see Astral Weeks popping up on the 10 greatest albums, or, it's one of those slow burn records. And as you say, I mean, nothing sounds like Spirit of Eden, but I think there's a kind of ethos behind it. There's a purity behind it. There's a madness behind it, a real sort of obsessional artistic vision that a lot of artists get very into. And there's a lot of, one of the things I struggled with in the book, well, not struggled, but I had to get a balance, is how much of the sort of technical side of it you can write about, because the way those records are made and they're produced is very important and intrinsic to what they sound like. But you don't want to have too much of that on the page, or it can get a bit dry.
Yeah, I think you say that at one point, is like, I could go into which pedals and which, but that's a niche readership.
It's very niche, and it's out there. If people are interested, that information is out there. But there's a little bit more writing about the miking up of drum kits than I maybe would have liked. But actually, it kind of does go somewhere, and it's important because the drums on those records are incredible, and they spent months on them. That's what they were doing for a long period of time, was trying to get the drum sound right. So I think there's that aspect where producers as well as artists were really, really into those records too, and trying to work out not so much how we can sound like that, but how we can make an album that also sounds kind of timeless and surprising and moving on from what we did before.
And I think it's at this point that I must try and remember the quote correctly, but you said something like it was almost human sampling, because they were bringing in so many other musicians to play maybe for a day or something, and then they would bring someone else in. There was quite a turnaround of musicians in the recording process.
Huge turnaround, and people that I had no idea, were called into that record and found wanting. Most of them were found wanting. But yeah, guys like Larry Klein, I had no idea, who was Joni Mitchell's husband at the time and a top end bass player, was called in and summarily dismissed very, very quickly. And they would erase it all. That's the other thing. They didn't keep them. They just erased it and they were gone. So yes, Nigel Kennedy famously comes in to play violin, and I think they keep literally one note. They took him to the pub afterwards. I mean, it is fun. For as much as the music is very pure and kind of beautiful, there's a lot of humor in the process, I think, as well, because it is kind of crazy. I was sort of thinking while they were making Spirit of Eden and Laughing Stock, it put me in mind of these kind of 17th century sailors who would just go off, around the Horn of Africa for a year and come back sort of half demented, and having gone out on some exhibition to try and find something. And there's this sort of crazed obsession about it that is it is funny. It's kind of amusing, because you wonder whether who was going to notice ultimately whether the mic was a half an inch away from the drum kit or not. Probably only one or two people in the world, but they were the people who were making the record. So, so yes, I think there's a kind of amusing kind of madness to the record making process. But then you sort of step back and go, well, but this is what they came up with. It was worth it in the end.
And so, Spirit of Eden doesn't do well, but yet is it the same record company that allows them to do Laughingstock?
No, so there's a big stramash really when Spirit of Eden's delivered. It's Parlophone, who are run by EMI, who say this is not. They tried to find a clause in the contract that said this: you haven't actually delivered a sellable record, and tried to get them again to do the single and to go in and do something else, and they flatly refused. So EMI did put the album out as delivered, but were kind of very unhappy about it. And at that point, Talk and their management found a clause in the contract, which they claimed meant that EMI had missed a chance to renew their contract, and they were free to leave.
Right.
And there was a very long legal process, but they were free. So they left. Again, it's a crazy story. They left after making Spirit of Eden and signed to Polydor for £2 million, and they were given this huge advance to make 2 records, and went on to make 2 even more commercially suicidal albums after that.
So I'm just thinking back. So the Mark Hollis solo album, which we will get onto in a moment, was part of that contract. So was it him that was in contract to them, really?
It's a good question. And I think he owed them to.
Yeah.
He signed to Polydor for 2 albums. Yeah.
Okay.
Because there was the solo album was originally kind of put down as a second Talk album for Polydor, but eventually it came out as a solo record because it was a solo record. There was nobody else who'd been involved in those Talk albums on it. But so the Laughingstock and the solo album were the fulfillment of his deal with Polydor.
So Laughingstock's an album that I hadn't really engaged with before at all. When did it come out? What was the date of that?
It came out September 1991.
Yeah. So this is a time when record companies, the bigger record companies, were still doing healthy business. So although 2 million, in retrospect seems like a lot, they've got a kind of named band still, and they're going to get a couple of albums from them. Now, it's interesting, I find, and many people I think consider looking at a lot of the reviews, that this is arguably their most challenging album. But it seems to me, reading the book, it's perhaps your favourite, or at least one that you made a close connection with.
I think it probably is they're all my favourites, really. I mean, there's very little in it, but I think it's the one I feel the most kind of close to. And also, I feel like I stick up for it, really, because in some way it's sometimes regarded as a sort of slightly lesser sibling to Spirit of Eden. That it's kind of, I think I write in the book, more of the same, but just a little less. And to me, it's a very different record. It sounds completely different. It was made very differently. The intent behind it was very, very different. And secondly, I think it goes even further. And it's incredibly beautiful. It's and that idea you were talking about of space and removal is just so fantastically executed on that record. And it's got maybe my favorite song of all time in it, which is New Grass, which I just think is an astonishing piece of work. So it's I feel sometimes it sort of misses out a little bit because of the love that's given to Spirit of Eden, but to me it's at least its equal and possibly slightly better. And
going back to timing, you said earlier on that you got your copy first week of university, was it? Yeah. So talk a bit about the connection you felt with this record, why you feel so strongly with it. Was this a time of, first week at university anywhere is a stressful time and a confusing time and all those things. Was this your kind of soundtrack to that period?
There was a few records that were a soundtrack to it. This was definitely one of them. Another one was Songs of Love by Mark Heitzel. This maybe gives you an idea of the kind of happy headspace I was in at that time. But yes, those records just are very synonymous with that period of time. And I think, and that kind of age, I would have been 18, just turned 18, and leaving my home. I was living in Bristol at the time and moving back to Scotland and going to uni in Glasgow. And it was, quite a confusing time. And I think, I write in the book that album, although it's my favorite, has very kind of, quite difficult connotations for me. It sums up quite a difficult period of time. And I think, and Phil Brown, the engineer, talks about it being a very dark period for him when he was making it. And it's interesting that I feel like I was miles, I was an 18-year-old miles away, and he was a 40-something, 50-something guy making the record, and we both kind of felt the same thing about it, that it's a challenging album. But I think I also say that I think it's consciously, difficult. I don't think that you want to project your own unhappiness onto music that's been very consciously made to sound a certain way. And I think it is above and beyond everything else. It's a very intentional record. It's supposed to sound abrasive, and it's supposed to sound the way that it does. So that was me just trying to work through a lot of that, I think. And I was also listening to the Replacements, and I was listening to The Cure, and I was listening to lots of and Van Morrison, lots of beautiful uplifting music as well. But it did seem to me, that world that I talk about, it kind of encapsulated a bit of where I was at that time in my life.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar. Sometimes you read a book or a book of poetry and absolutely hits you when and where it's supposed to. Subsequently, they're so strongly linked that you've really got to want to go back to that time and place. Sometimes you don't want to go back to that.
No, and there'll have been very large periods in my life when I didn't listen to Laughing Stock, for various reasons, but that would be one of them. And I mentioned Songs of Love, Mark Out, so that's a record I have to be very careful about kind of opening the lid on, because it literally just drags you straight into that headspace, which could, is interesting, but you just got to be careful with it. So one of the lovely things with the amount of time that's passed about doing the book was, because obviously I listened very, very intensely again to these records, and was kind of being reminded of that, but also being free of it in a way. I could just listen to it as music as well, and just see it for what it is, which is just a very, very carefully made piece of art.
So the next album it features, which is The Winter in the book, is Mark Hollis, the solo album, and this happens to be one of my favorite albums, and one I do play still quite a lot. And I was thinking why that was, but it came out in 1998. Is that right? 1998. And I was thinking, I was really kind of into a lot of folk and folk leaning stuff at the time. I was listening to like June Tabor at the time, but Eliza Carthy, the Lilac Time were making some amazing music, and also going back to kind of Nick Drake stuff as well. So it kind of fitted in with a lot of what was happening at the time, post Britpop. There was a lot of introspection, and this, to me, it's a suitable ending for the story that you're telling. I think it's really pared down. It's quite fragile in places, but I mean, a real kind of beauty to it as well.
Stunningly beautiful, and I get that resonance that you talk about, that kind of English pastoral thing almost, that it's which he's always had in his voice and his writing, but I think here it really comes out in the sound as well, because it's all acoustic. And it's a lot of woodwind and a lot of acoustic guitars and acoustic bass, and it's just got that real sort of burnished quality, and it's sort of slight folk and jazz and in there. And I think I do write in the book that maybe I'm glad he stopped after this. You can kind of hear it coming to an end. I think, again, it was a very attritional process to make the record. It should have been very simple, because they wanted to write everything and score everything in advance and then just record it in the studio. But as usual, it didn't work out quite as simply as that, so it took a long time. Excuse me. So I was almost relieved. I kind of felt at the end of it, I thought, I'm glad he stopped, actually. I think it was getting a bit hard. And he's writing for woodwind, which is a very, very difficult instrument to write for if you're not a classically trained writer. And so it's a beautiful record, but I feel like, and I think I write again that if you look at from where he started with punk stuff and then the synth pop stuff and then to where he'd come, that's a pretty big journey.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reflection in the album maybe some regret as well in there, and you do feel, well, where would they have gone next? You
Mm.
know, how much more could you take out without it being, you know, John Cage and just silence?
Yeah, or is the radical thing going back to the 3 minute pop song, which
Yeah,
I just don't think. I think he was capable of doing. Maybe he wasn't by then, but clearly didn't want to do that.
I don't think he had the appetite
No.
for something like that. Now we need to talk a little bit more about Mark Hollis because I didn't realize what a complex character this guy is. Because what's clear is musical genius, absolutely, but he liked his football. He liked his, you know, I mean, a real unexpected blend of characters, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, a very down to earth kind of North London, Essex guy, where he grew up in both those places, and very unpretentious, very sarcastic, very funny, very dry. The antithesis of the kind of rock and roll, roisterer. He was, happily married for a long, long time, had 2 kids, was not that kind of guy. So, as I think I said earlier, where this stuff kind of came from, where it lived in his day-to-day life, is really difficult to see. It's difficult to find. I mean, he was into art house film, and he was into huge swathes of music from all over the place, but he didn't present himself as that kind of atheist. He was just a normal. I think I say he was a geezer and a seeker, and I think that's the seeker lived in the music and the records. It didn't really seem to manifest itself anywhere else in his life, particularly.
The kind of geezer side, it seems at time was one of the reasons that people stopped working with him, because I mean it seems like bullying at points.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. I think there was a lot of bullying, particularly on Laughingstock, and Lee Harris, the drummer, and there's people who, again, those sort of slightly outside voices who were just observing what was going on, said it wasn't a nice thing to do to someone, who was a member of the band, to just be getting them to play over and over again, to kind of be keeping them out of the creative process, but to be so demanding of them with so little reward, actually, in terms of what they would say to them. So he was a difficult guy to work with. I think part of that was that inability to express himself or to articulate what he wanted. It's just do it again.
There must have been people who perhaps sought him out thinking they were going to get a really complex musical chat, and he went, "Oh no, just talk about anything but that."
Yeah, there's some funny anecdotes in the book. He worked a lot with Dominic Miller, who was Sting's again a bit weird Sting's guitar player, who he worked with on the solo record, and he would say, we'd go to the pub and I couldn't engage with him on any kind of intellectual level. He would talk about Spurs. He'd be like, "You see that fucking goal Sol Campbell scored last night? Fucking hell!" And he'd drink Guinness and he'd talk about TV. He loved EastEnders. Or he would sit in silence for 5 minutes, quite happily not conversing. He hated small talk, and yet he didn't really seem to want to talk much about his own work or to engage on that level in many ways. And I think, certainly once he stopped making music, if people brought up, "Well, what are you doing now? What are you working on?" he would just shut down. He didn't want to talk about that stuff.
He would stop recordings to watch EastEnders. Is that right?
He did The Colour of Spring, yeah. He would
it made me think about Bowie, who did, I think he got the videos of EastEnders taped and sent to him so that he could. I think that's right. I'm sure I can't have made that story up, but I'm sure that's right.
But all these guys, yeah, because I mean, with I think famously Bowie and Tony Visconti were big into Peter Cook and Dudley Moore and all that stuff, and doing those voices. But there's more of a Derek and Clive vibe with Talk Talk. It's quite it's quite ripe. I've heard a few outtakes in the studio, and this music sounds sacred. And Phil Brown, who was the engineer, went, there was nothing sacred about these sessions at all. They were fun often, but they were brutal and very sarcastic and very very punishing on the people around them.
Something else I'd never noticed till listening again, it was because we were talking about where he was from and place, is that his voice sounds quite similar to Paul Weller.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of where they're from, both of them. Yeah,
you can hear that. I think that comparison was made a little bit in the early part of
Right.
his career. I think people did compare him to Paul Weller. You can definitely hear it once you sort of tune into it.
Yeah,
A bit
definitely.
of Robert Wyatt. I mean, there's that very English kind of soulfulness about it. Quite idiosyncratic, very passionate, but very, very English. It's not. There's no kind of. Although he loved R&B and gospel music, but there is this sense of a kind of English soul music that's coming out.
We should talk a little bit about the other central characters and members and their roles. So, who was his major collaborator and how did that relationship work out?
Well, so the band as originally formed was Lee Harris was the drummer and Paul Webb was the bass player, and they were Southend guys from Essex who were a bit younger than him, and they were kind of drafted in after he'd got a record contract. So although they were a band and a team, he was always the senior figure in the band. And then and Simon Brenner, who was the keyboard player on the first album, and then he left. He was the first guy who Mark couldn't deal with or couldn't deal with Mark. And then Tim Freescreen comes in, and he's a fascinating guy, and he was really a jobbing producer. He famously worked with Tight Fit. He produced The Lion Sleeps Tonight, and just did loads of stuff with punk bands and pop bands, and this was just a kind of marriage of convenience. They met up to produce the second record, but they also started writing together, and this sort of very simpatico relationship was established very quickly, I think, where they wrote together and then co-produced the records together and played a lot of the music on the records together. So he is the central figure in the music, aside from Mark Hollis, no question about it. He's again a very interesting, enigmatic person who no longer talks about talk either. So the way those records were written is really still kind of locked away behind the door of wherever they were doing that stuff. They would write together the exact kind of percentages of who did what in terms of the music is still a bit of a mystery. Mark obviously wrote the lyrics and he wrote the melodies and he sang them, but the construction of the songs was very much a collaboration right through to the end.
You mentioned Tight Fit there. One of the joys of the book is some of the names that pop up throughout. So did Tim go back and just be a producer again, or what did he do afterwards?
Well, even during he was making, certainly was after Spirit of Eden, he went and worked with Catherine Wheel. He worked with Lush, those kind of melody maker bands from the 90s.
Easy bands, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think he was the one who was maybe bringing in a bit more of a contemporary feel to some of the sounds on those records, because Mark certainly wasn't listening to anything like that at all. He was listening to jazz and blues really mostly. So I think Tim was someone who was bringing in a lot of kind of more contemporary knowledge. And then then he they parted the ways after Laughingstock, I think, and that was Tim's decision. Mark, I think, would have continued quite happily to work together, but I think Tim felt on Laughingstock they kind of reached the end of where they could go with this music.
Yeah.
And he went off and played. He formed his own outfit called Heligoland, and he's made music ever since. And he's very much a kind of it's not this very precious thing. It's very much kind of Bandcamp, SoundCloud, just doing very interesting experimental stuff, putting out there. Fascinating guy, actually, very, very creative, very productive. And I think probably the collaborator that Mark needed. All his best work really was made in tandem with him.
I hadn't listened to Heligoland, but I have now, and it's some fantastic stuff. Some of it not too dissimilar.
I agree. I think you can hear some of the abrasiveness, some of the sounds that he loves, these kind of distorted guitars and harmonica and very sonically interesting stuff. I think you can definitely hear what he brought to those records, which was really substantial. Yeah.
How did writing this book compare to other ones that you've written? Are they each different every time?
Yeah, and it never gets any easier or more sort of. I never quite know what I'm doing. Weirdly, it was a difficult book to write because it should have been a book that came before the last book I wrote, which was a collaboration with Jim Kerr and Charlie. Our Secrets Are the Same. That kind of came in the middle of it for various reasons. So I had a lot of stuff going back 4 or 5 years that I wrote. And then I finished it about a year ago, or up to the end of last year. So it was quite bitty in a sense, and I think a part of that was just trying to work out the structure of it, how that would come together, how much of me to put in there. That's probably a more of a new thing, and I think more and more I'm writing less about the kind of whole arc of a band story and more about very specific parts of it. And so that weirdly, I think in some ways that makes it more difficult or takes a bit longer, because you're sort of pairing appropriately enough. You're paring down, you're kind of editing, you're working out what belongs in there. I really didn't want to dutifully go through go through the first 2 records of Talk Talk when I didn't really honestly didn't care that much about them, and I suppose if you're doing the full birth, life, death of a band, you kind of feel you have to cover it. And so I had to work out the context of making sure people kind of understood where the band came from and what had come before, without it being too long-winded and too in-depth, because I didn't really want to do that. So there was all these little bits that sort of made it take, I think, a little longer than usual, and a bit more piecemeal and a bit trickier in some ways.
I think that's really interesting. I think the interludes, your personal reflections, actually link everything together. And quite unusually, I think, in a music book, it's a real page turner. You want to see kind of what happens next and what happens with the next album and all of that. And that's partly because you've got this compelling character at the center of it.
I think so. There's a mystery, and I think, there's a big question. Mark Hollis says, well, why did he stop making music? What happened next? And I thought, well, I honestly don't know. I'm never going to find out. We don't really know why he even made the music he made. So we're not going to find out why he didn't make the music he didn't make, if that makes any sense. So I thought one of the guiding principles was always, I'm going to write about what actually happened and what we can hear. I'm not going to spend too much time writing about the what ifs or the maybes or this is why this happened or this is why this didn't happen. I thought, let's just write about what this guy actually created. And I think in doing that, you might understand why he stopped. I think the clues are in the music, and the clues are in the way he worked. You can work it out for yourself why he stopped. There's no great revelation, of something that happened in his life. Yeah. It's quite clear, I think, from how he made music and how he looked at his life, and how the idea about character and virtue that I talk about quite a lot in the book. I think you can work out for yourself why someone like that might have just said, that's enough, I've done my job.
But I think by not having a lot of biography, so to speak, you really do have to dig deep into the albums to find out where the story is. And perhaps that's where the story is, and perhaps that's always where the story is in the records themselves.
I think increasingly I agree with that. I think, well, I don't want to, sort of denounce everything I've ever done, but I think with some artists it's just more appropriate than others, and for me this is like, look, the guy was a bit of a blank canvas, really. I mean, he clearly gave us the most interesting part of himself in what he created, and how he did it. There's a lot in there that we can learn, if you wish, about him, but also let's just look at what he did. It's extraordinary work. It's revealing work. It's mysterious. As I say, these are puzzles that don't really want to be solved, and I'm quite fine with that. It's like a conversation that you throw out some ideas and you can take them or leave them. So yeah, this was a book definitely where I felt there's no point really in trying to dig around in the guy's soul to work out kind of who he was. It's the soul is in the music.
Reading it, there was a band comparison I kept going back to, probably because they're never far from my thoughts, but it was the Blue Nile in terms of not only how they work, but their output too. Was that something you could agree with in terms of comparison?
Yeah, I mean, they're another band that over the years I've thought, I'd love to write long form about the Blue Nile. And yes, the kind of 4 perfect albums on this incredibly, languid working process, and also, this, I guess, Paul, is still, I think, working on a new album, but this kind of prolonged silence that's coming towards, the end, the latter stages of their making music. And also the kind of gradual dissipation of that band and the people in it. So there are parallels there. I was thinking about that. And again, a band where you almost sense that the personalities are wanting to disappear
Yes.
into the music. You know, it's like this is what's important. We're projecting this out. We're going back into the shadows because this is the best of us, really. This is what's going to make films in your head and make you feel something. Is not how we're living our lives, but what we're creating.
And I think these bands are really interesting in a modern context when everyone is told, get as much of yourself out there as possible. You know, you've almost all the time, every minute.
Mm.
A band who just lets the music out there and, you know, you discover it and you fall in love with it and all of those things is an interesting one.
Yeah, and probably two bands that benefited from, you know, the major label system back then, being able to kind of sign on the basis of being quite a commercial proposition to start with, and then taking that and making beautiful things with it. I don't know if you could do that anymore. I don't know if you could spend that amount of time in a studio to make a 6-track record that isn't going to sell any copies. But there's something really beautiful about the fact that they did that.
So if it's not a Blue Nile book, can you say what is next for you? Can you say, are you working on something?
I'd say there's a couple of things that are just kind of getting over the line, which should be announced fairly soon. But Blue Nile, I would love to write about the Blue Nile, so it might be on the to write list, as I was saying at the beginning. But yeah, I feel it's a good space for me to work in, is that kind of idea of going quite deep into quite a concentrated amount of music.
Well, we'll definitely have you back on for that, Graeme. There's no doubt about that.
Oh, great.
And as I said to you at the start, I was listening to the albums almost as a soundtrack to reading the book because of the way it's structured. You can do that. And I wondered if writing the book and listening again made you reassess these records.
Definitely, yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I found, like, Spirit of Eden has this slightly daunting reputation as being, you know, a very inaccessible work, and I found I've never really found it, but even more so now going back to it, I think it's a really accessible.
I would agree.
Album, you know, it's bursting with melody and beauty and very, very accessible songs. So that became much clearer to me listening to it over and over again. I thought these are amazingly accessible tunes, and I think Paul Webb once said they're pop songs. They're stretched and they're deconstructed and they're put through the rack a little bit, but those are still beautiful pop songs, and that became very clear to me. And I write about Laughingstock being a blues album, and I think that sense resonance became very clear to me as well, about how much of a guitar album it is, how isolated it is, how that sense of kind of that primordial sense of the kind of Delta blues is really deeply ingrained in that record, which is not what I associate Talk Talk being very English and kind of pastoral and all those things, and so that really brought me a whole new perspective on that record. And so yeah, you learn. That's the beauty of those records. You're learning things about them all the time. And I listened to them obsessively while I was writing it, and it's lovely to hear that people are listening while they read the book, because I think it is kind of designed. Excuse me, it's designed for that to be the case. And there's a short chapter on a song called New Grass, and it's designed to last the length of the song. There's a little tip for anyone reading it. If you read that chapter, obviously mileages will vary with your reading speed, but it's designed to kind of last the length of the song while you're reading it.
Oh, fantastic. A little bit like the theory that Pink Floyd and the Wizard of Oz, if you run them together.
That's right. That's my little homage to that. Yeah.
Excellent. Graeme, it's always a pleasure to catch up and talk with you, but particularly about this book, which, you know, I absolutely loved. And it made me fall in love again with a band I hadn't thought about for a while, you know, so thank you for that.
Oh, no, thank you so much, Ali. That's lovely to hear, and it's always a treat to chat.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.